Good evening. How's everybody tonight? We're all Marconi'd. So in our continuing exploration of the entertainment music industry circa 2016, here we are again. Tonight we're very fortunate to have with us a very gifted author, journalist. Made a long journey here. He's originally from the Midwest, although born in New England. The word free has a lot of connotations. Might mean something to each and one of you individually in a different way. Could be freedom to do things when you want. Could be getting things for free. It could be escaping from something. But the word free happens to be in the title of tonight's book, How Music Got Free. The end of an industry, the turn of the century, and the patient zero of piracy. Our guest and author tonight is Stephen Witt. I'm sure many of you have read the book, possibly for this class, possibly for other classes. It's been around for, almost a year? About a year now. Much of what he said here is still quite valid, although, as you all know, we're in a very fluid industry and things change. Daily things change. It's always something in the news about free. So there's three concurrent stories from my perspective that went on in the book. And correct me please if I'm wrong.
Sure.
The evolution and development of the MP3. The current chairman of Sony Music, who at the time was not at Sony when much of this took place, Doug Morris. And then the situation of what went on originally it was run by Polygram and later was sold to Universal, a pressing plant in the Carolinas, and how all this came together. I mentioned to Steve on the way that during my tenure at Universal, they had asked me to get involved and oversee the new media department. It's an interesting choice of words, but new media. And a part of that was the digital distribution of our music. One of our big artists at the time was a fellow, I'm sure you're all familiar with Nelly. In fact, I believe Barry Weiss was here last week. Nelly's one of his artists. At the time, Nelly was a Platinum Plus artist at Universal. He'd had 2 albums. I guess this was his 3rd album coming out. And I had a couple of people working with me who were a lot more internet savvy and did a lot of things that I couldn't imagine how to do. But I had one fellow worked for me, and he said, I'm on the Nelly fan page, and he goes, there's this guy on there who's emailing kind of regularly boasting that he's going to have the Nelly album before anyone else. Now, part of my charge was to keep an eye on anything that was going on that might, disrupt a new release. In fact, we employed a company, put out what they call spoofs.
Right.
So I'd hire a company, and they would put out these, I guess they were MP3s, of songs, but they really weren't. And when you opened it up, it said, it's not what you think it is, but it was labeled something else. And it was to try to keep people who were trying to, steal stuff from actually finding the real stuff. In fact, maybe it wasn't anything real out there, but if it was a big enough release, we would hire this company, and they'd flood the internet with what was called spoofs. So at this time, we were concerned that somebody was going to mess around with Nelly, and we didn't really want to lose those kind of sales, and it was an important release for us. Well, sure enough, one day comes to my office, fellow, and he says, "Yeah, this guy's posted. He's got the whole album up there." I said, "Wow, how did he do that?" He goes, "I don't know." I said, "Well, can we track down his ISP, where his emails based, what server where it's coming from?" and for some reason we were able to, and tracked him down to some little hamlet in Germany. How does a guy in Germany get the Nelly album before anyone else? It was puzzling. But I mentioned it to our head of international, and he said, you know, Steve, Universal has a pressing plant in Germany. So where is it? So we pull out a map and look and we go, oh, he's about 30 miles away from the pressing plant. Somebody in the pressing plant obviously was doing some hooky-doo and was able to leak it. So we got a hold of this guy and told him he'd better take it down, or he's subject to all sorts of rules and regulations. And so eventually he did, but the damage had been done. Months prior to that, I had gone to Florida. There's a distributor called Alliance.
Okay.
Alliance was a company that provided CD service as well as other things to chains such as, I believe, maybe Kmart, but their big one was Barnes & Noble. So the record company had to ship quantities of new releases, particularly big artists, to Alliance. And then Alliance, as a sub-distributor, would break it down and distribute and ship it either to Barnes & Noble's main distributor or possibly to each individual store. So if new music was to both get there on a Friday for a sale on the weekend, it was possible that the stores would get copies in advance and several days. So it occurred to me, I said, wow, this is an opportunity for theft left and right. You have guys at Alliance who can open a box of 25 and pull one out, take it to their friend at the put it on the internet. Or if it's getting to the store 2 or 3 days before the consumer can actually buy it, and there was always stores that would put stuff out a couple of days before they're supposed to, just to get the jump on things. Or somebody in the store, a clerk in the store, and you know, clerks aren't getting paid a lot, they're paying minimum wage, they could pull a CD out and sell it to somebody, and all of a sudden on the internet. So there were a lot of ways it occurred to me that this could not be controlled. And so there was a lot of paranoia in the record labels, what went on in the studio, because there was a lot of talk that possibly the engineers, were making extra copy, and the master would go to the mastering plant, and another copy would go out the back door to somebody. So it was always that fear and phobia, and it hit home to me because I hadn't thought about it in quite some time when I started reading, particularly the section in the book that dealt with what happened in the Carolinas. So what made me curious was, you're a guy living in Brooklyn, from the Midwest. How, you read the book, but how the heck do you track down some guy that no one else has in the Carolinas who's responsible for causing, I don't know how much money and damages to the industry?
Extraordinary economic damage. Well, I guess you guys have heard from music executives, and you're all musicians, and you've heard from management types, but you probably haven't heard from a pirate, and that's what I was. When I showed up to college in 1997, I had one of these beige box computers. Most of you were born around 96 or 97. So computing technology at that time, when you were born, weighed about 20 pounds, and it had 2 gigabytes of hard drive space. So your cell phone today weighs about 4 ounces and has 64 gigabytes of hard drive space. But I showed up to college, and before this, I'd been buying compact discs at the mall when I wasn't shoplifting them, and which is old school. So I show up, and you have these new technologies that had been invented by these German sound engineers that could take the information on a compact disc and compress it by 91, 92%. Simultaneously, really for the first time, you had broadband internet. You guys won't remember what it was like to use a dial-up phone modem to call into the internet, but that's how it used to be. It was extremely slow. It'd take you 3 minutes to load a single image. Instagram would take about 4 hours to scroll down your feed for like 10 photos. But now there was broadband, which was much faster. And so for the first time, it was like turning on the internet. And it was combined with these microscopically sized files. So soon enough, all of the kids who would be about your age started to build this secret shadow infrastructure for music distribution that the music industry didn't want to touch. By the time I sort of ended my first year at college, that 2 gigabyte hard drive was completely full of pirated music. And as I got more into it, I ended up getting into the torrent scene and the deeper underground of it. And by '07 or '08, I had 15,000 albums.
Now, did you listen to that? I mean,
No. I mean, it would take a year and a half to listen to it all.
So this was just consumption for
It was
the sake of-
hoarding. Yeah, it was the collector's impulse where you just go out and get a bunch of crap you don't need because it's free.
But if you had to buy this, you would never have bought
If I
that
caught,
much.
I mean, wouldn't have had the money. It would have cost me well $250,000 to buy that many albums at CD retail prices. So that's the sort of notional economic value of what I had. On the flip side, it is just a hard drive full of bits, so what's it really worth? You know, and that dichotomy was playing out in front of me. I'd grown up thinking that music was a physical object that you went to the store to get. You know, it was inventory, and that's how the music industry thought about it. But to the engineers who invented the MP3, all those racks of CDs at the mall, they weren't inventory. They were just an array of inefficiently stored data. And what they wanted to do was take all the bits on the plastic where it could be scuffed and destroyed and stolen and put it in a centralized computer server and then served, you know, as needed out. And that's eventually what we got to. But the recalcitrance of the music industry to get involved in such a scheme because they were making so much money off the compact disc delayed that process for 10 or 15 years. And so in the meantime, you had these punk kids in their mom's basements and in college dormitories doing it for them. And that's how all this stuff was available. And you ask the question, well, how did I get to the central character of the book? You know, in '08 or '09, I finally was just looking at this enormous trove. Spotify hadn't really kicked in yet, so we were still just using iTunes to get our albums. I was like, Jesus, how did it all really get here anyway? And I started to investigate it, and it turned out that there was a hardcore underground of probably about 1,000 pirates that were responsible for seeding almost all of the file-sharing networks like LimeWire and torrent sites and Napster with almost all of the material that was available on there. Now, I'd always assumed it was just crowdsourced, like they were just, you know, okay, I log into LimeWire, I put up a file, and I take down a file or whatever. That wasn't true. Way, way, way in the internet underground, there were like 1,000 guys who had dedicated their lives to leaking stuff to the internet, and they had begun to infiltrate the supply chain of the entertainment industry. And the best mole that they ever got was a guy named Del Glover, who was a factory worker at a compact disc factory in North Carolina. And his job was to take the compact disc, finished off the pressing machines behind him, and feed it into a shrink wrapper. That's all he did. He got paid $10 an hour to do this. It was a temporary factory job that he played into perm. But what that meant was that he had the hottest music of the year weeks and sometimes months ahead of its official release dates, literally at his fingertips. So if you could find a way to get the CDs out of the tray and smuggle them out past plant security and post them to the internet, then they would be copied millions of times, right? And so he would become, instead of the Sam Goody or all the record stores or iTunes, he would become the primary point of distribution for all music, and it only took one CD to do this. So the plant knew this, right? And they were concerned about this. They'd set up the security regime where as you were leaving the plant, you would swipe your employee turnstile or your employee badge through the turnstile, and if you got a red light, they'd take you over to the side, they'd make you stand like this. And they had an aluminum detecting wand that they would wand over your body, searching for that like thin aluminum sliver in the disc. And if they found it on your body, like you were like secreting in your clothes or whatever, they would fire you immediately and charge you with embezzlement. And you know, get the police involved. But Glover had watched thousands of people exit the plant over the years, and one thing he always noticed, this was like small town North Carolina, right, was that everybody was wearing these big like belt buckles, like Stars and Bars belt buckles, right? And these would always set off the wand as they were wanding the people, but the security guards would never make you take it off. It was just a rent-a-cop. They didn't really care. So what you would do when you're on the factory floor is you'd take the discs that were slated to be destroyed in a plastics grinder because they would have overstock on the run. You just needed one, remember. You take one disc, you take your rubber glove and you'd tape it off like this and tie it off. And then you'd cinch it behind your belt buckle. And then when you got hit with the wand and they hit the belt buckle, you'd be like, well, it didn't do anything. Like, it's just a belt buckle. And they're like, okay, go through. So in this way, Glover and his smuggling confederates got 2,000 albums out of the plant over the course of about 7 years, including all of the major hits of the era. Meanwhile, at the top, in the boardroom, guys like Doug Morris were consolidating the industry into one big thing. And the faster they could do that, the more hits came through the factory floor. So Glover leaked 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Trying. He leaked the Eminem Show. He leaked Taylor Swift's first album. He leaked Justin Bieber's album. He leaked U2's How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb. He leaked Nelly, who you mentioned before, so a different Nelly album, I think. Right. He leaked Rick Ross, and when they caught him, finally, he had leaked all 3 of Kanye West's first albums, including Graduation. When they caught him, it was actually in the CD player of his car. He had just leaked it. And you guys remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, remember like Kanye West had like a sales competition with 50 Cent, and it made like the cover of Rolling Stone over who would sell more albums? Glover leaked both of those albums. He leaked them both. So in fact, he won the sales competition, right? So he would get these albums out, and then they'd make their way to this releasing group, these underground releasing groups, and within 24 hours, because they were making perfect digital copies, there'd be millions of copies of this stuff all over the globe. So the vast majority of what you could find on Napster and LimeWire, and if any of you guys still have any of this stuff lying around in your iPods, all of that music can be traced back to just one person.
So how did you get to meet? I mean,
so how did I get to meet him? Well, let me get to first, why did he do it?
Okay.
Why did he do it, right? Because a lot of these guys were just anarchists. I think they were really just thrill-seeking anarchists who loved the rush of leaking music from artists. And this is still a huge problem that plagues the industry. How many of you you're all musicians, right? Here's a show of hands, like how many of you think you'll be musicians, or like how many of you think you'll be producers in 10 years? A few producers. How many of you think you'll be like in management? A lot of management, okay, good. And how many of you think you'll be like a label executive, more business side of it? Okay. And how many of you are going to be rock stars or rap stars? You got one rap star back there, good. Okay, so it's a good mix. It's a good mix. The mastering process now, they've got it so tightly controlled because they're so concerned about leaks. And it still happens all the time. And they botched their own release cycle. Rihanna leaked her own album, I think unintentionally, via Tidal. I don't think they were intending to do that. But all you need is something to appear unsecured on the internet for 20 seconds, and it's gone. So how did I find this guy? So what Glover would do is he would take his compact discs and he would go into the secret internet underground, and he would trade them with other people who were leaking other material. And he particularly was interested in the DVD releasing scenes. Now what these guys would do is they would also have a plant inside a DVD factory somewhere leaking something else, or they would bribe to get inside of Walmart early and get inside of Walmart's inventory and leak stuff out while it was still in the store but before it was on the shelves. Or they would get a lot of Oscar DVD screeners that they would send to the Academy, and they'd leak those really early. And so Glover had pre-release access to all of that stuff way before any of the other bootleggers and way before the rest of the internet, okay? And so he would get these movies, and then he would take them home to a DVD duplicating tower in his house, and he had probably 3 of these. So he could burn 20 movies at once. He'd burn thousands and thousands of first-run unreleased movies and then sell them out of the trunk of his car for about $5 a pop. And demand was intense because nowhere, even on the rest of the internet, could you get this stuff. So people would drive from 50 miles away and park their car in his lawn to buy these leaked movies from him. And eventually his operation got so big that he had to deputize a workforce, and it grew elaborate. He would go to the barber shops all around North Carolina, and he would drop off a spindle of discs, like 500 discs, with the barber, and then come back a week later and collect on consignment like $1,000 in cash from these guys. So he made several $100,000 this way, and the barbers made more money selling his bootleg movies than they did cutting hair. He really liked. He wanted to pimp out his ride, so he invested a lot of the money he was making as a bootlegger back into his car. So he ended up putting these. Do you guys remember spinners? Do you guys know what spinners? You remember spinners? So he decided that he didn't want spinners. He wanted a different kind of rim called a floater, which is on an independent bearing. And so like when you drive the car, the rim appears to stay still. So my book is about the guy who destroyed the music industry so he could put rims on his car. The FBI caught him in 2007 after a long manhunt. They knew there was somebody out there, and they had been working with the Recording Industry Association of America to find him. It took him forever. He was really good at what he did. The scene he was part of was really good with encryption, and they were really deeply underground. Whenever the FBI prosecutes someone, those prosecutions, all of the paperwork that's generated at trial is put in a massive legal electronic database called PACER. And when I was researching this story, this is how I found him, actually, via his legal prosecution, via his court case. You know, I was looking in, I had discovered the existence of this underground community of media leakers, and a lot of them had gone to jail. And so I was looking through hundreds of FBI cases that had prosecuted different members of this scene. And when I got to Glover's and I read the statement of facts in the case, I was like, holy, everything on the internet goes back to like this one guy. It's one factory worker in North Carolina. This guy did more damage to the record industry than all of the other 99 leakers combined. So I didn't know him. I didn't know anything about him, but I knew where he lived and his general sort of demographic profile information. I was like, okay, this is like, he's black, he's like 38, he lives in North Carolina, and his name is Del Glover. There can't be that many people who fit that description. So I started trolling on Facebook looking for this guy. And I finally found a guy that matched the description. I wrote him a Facebook message saying, hi, I'm a journalist in New York. I'd love to make your acquaintance and talk to you if you want to share your story with me. I'm not even sure I have the right guy, but I figure what the hell, there's no harm done. And the next day he called me on my cell phone. We talked for about 8 hours. I went to visit him 6 different times. And eventually I developed the raw material for this book from that. I was a graduate student when I did that. I mean, I was a student in journalism school when I started working on this. So that's how I found him.
And he was obviously was open and receptive talking to you?
He just got out of prison. He just got out of, he only served 3 months in prison because he was agreed to testify against his co-conspirators in the crime, including his controller, who was the spy master of music leaking, this kid whose screen handle was Kali. And that's who the FBI's real target was. This guy was controlling moles all over the world. He had guys in Germany, he had guys in Italy, working for radio stations, working for promo companies. Some of them probably were students like you because they used to send advanced promo copies to the student radio stations as well. And so this guy was really like the leak master. He was the spy master of the whole thing. And the guys would go and they'd get their leaked CDs and then they'd burn them to MP3 on their home computers and then they'd email them to him as the distribution node. He was the one who did the distributing. So if you could get a hold of this guy's laptop in California, this one 26-year-old insurance agent had an army of 20 leakers that he was controlling. And on his laptop was the most up-to-date music library in the entire world. He could have DJ'd a party and had music that wasn't going to come out for months, right? It's just this one kid.
Isn't that how someone got caught?
A few people got caught in this way, yeah. But he never got caught. He was very canny. And they finally prosecuted him, but he was found innocent. They never got him. So he got off scot-free. His name was Adil Kassim. From Grenada Hills, California. He loved to smoke weed, and he loved Ludacris, and he lived with his mom. And he gutted the music industry. He destroyed it.
So you think either of these guys had any thought of what they were costing, the economy, the musicians, the record companies?
No, I don't think they ever thought twice about it. They were punk kids. I mean,
so they were just doing it for and giggles?
A lot of them were, to be honest with you. I interviewed probably 10 or 12 of these guys. A lot of high school dropouts, a lot of kids with intelligence but very little motivation, not really doing a lot in their lives. Kind of reminded me of like a Craigslist weed dealer or something like that kind of vibe. But they loved music. They loved music and they loved the artists. And I don't think they were deliberately trying to hurt them. I just think that this was the hobby that they got caught into. And I think a lot of them felt they were really sticking it to the man. I think a lot of them really felt, hey, those big labels like Doug Morris and their $10 million bonuses over in the Sony building in Manhattan. Let's screw that guy over. And I remember one of them saying, I was like, well, he'd leaked Rihanna's first album. I was like, didn't you feel bad for Rihanna? He's like, no, she's getting paid. You know, that was their mentality.
It's interesting. I was, knowing that you were here, I just did a little work, and I guess in Yale University they had an article in one of their publications called Ethical Considerations in Music Piracy, which is an interesting title. And one of the arguments posed was that piracy is not theft because theft entails removing the original item, whereas piracy leaves the original intact and just copies it.
Legally, it's not theft. These guys are not charged with larceny. They're charged with a crime called conspiracy to commit copyright infringement. And what that really means is bootlegging. Depending on the industry, it can be a huge problem. For music, interestingly, actually, and this is I think the big point, piracy is actually declining pretty rapidly. Most people are, how many of you, show of hands, pay to subscribe to a music service like Spotify or Apple Music? Okay. And how many of you rely just on the ad-supported streaming tier? Fewer. So most of you are paying, right? Most of you are paying. And if it's $5 a month for students, is that right? You know, when I was, so that's actually pretty good. When I was your age, nobody paid for. I mean, I think I stopped buying CDs, and I think the last CD I ever purchased with my own money was an album called Mutations by the artist Beck, who's still hanging around. I love that album. But after that, it was all piracy for about 10 years until I finally subscribed to Spotify. But there was an interstitial period where it was just really hard to find the music you wanted online legally. And it was costly and kind of cumbersome. And now, with sort of the advent of the streaming service, it's really come around. The problem there, though, is, and this is why I don't think, even though piracy is declining rapidly, we haven't seen a growth in profitability of the music industry. During the 90s, what they were doing, and this was the model that Doug Morris really loved, and all of the record industry execs from that era really wanted to keep pushing. You'd have a hit song. You'd have one hit. You guys remember the song No Diggity? Do you guys know this song? It's a massive hit when I was about 15, and it was everywhere. And Blackstreet really just had that one song. It was really just a Dr. Dre song that Blackstreet sort of showed up and sang over, but it could have been anybody. But Blackstreet went double platinum, I think, just off one song. Just off one song. They think about what that means. They made about $30 million in gross revenue from one hit song. Okay. Because to get that song, you had to go out and buy an album. Okay, you had to pay $14 or $15 to get a compact disc and take it home with you, right? You had to buy the whole album. Now, the contemporary version of whoever Blackstreet is, who's the biggest one-hit wonder lately, Meghan Trainor, okay, big one-hit wonder, probably. Nobody's buying her album, right? They're just buying that one song. So rather than making $30 million off of it, she probably only gets, $1 or $2 million gross revenue. And that's at the top line. That's before her label, her manager, her agent, and her lawyer, and the rights holders and the performers take a cut, right? So in the end, she's making very little off selling music. And I don't think we'll ever go back to that era where you can just have one hit song and sell 2 million albums on that basis. I just don't see it ever coming back. So really what was happening is for a long time, the music industry was over-earning. The contemporary model is much more efficient for customers, right? We only pay for exactly what we listen to now. In the old days, I had all these albums, and I didn't like a lot of them. I'd go to the store and buy 4 or 5 albums, and 2 of them would suck, and I'd listen to them once, And that deadweight loss of the $15 I just spent was just gone. It was out the window. The music industry got to pocket it. But under almost no conceivable circumstances will we ever go back to that.
And yet, the piracy, it's debated that maybe that does increase demand for the particular song. Is that? And then there's the cost of what it's cost the economy, because it's not just the musician who's losing out or just the record company. It's the non-existent retail base.
Right. Well, I think even without piracy, even without piracy, retail is just getting smashed by online retailing anyway, and that's legally happening, right? So all of the big box, not just the record stores, but all of the big box stores are starting to shut down. So you can see that trend is going to happen with or without piracy, I would say.
And it's hard to find a retail store that carries music
It's hard to find a retail store. I mean, how many of you guys have purchased a compact disc in the past year? Oh, a lot. So a lot of you still listen to compact discs. How many of you bought a vinyl record? More. Interesting. When I was, vinyl records, I think had cratered around 2000. I think they were selling about one a year at that time. Yeah, and now they're really back. Huh.
And there's Record Store Day. One of the big products that they sell is vinyl, special limited edition vinyls of things that are limited edition.
And you guys have record players and stuff, like cheap ones or like the fancy. Who's gonna got a fancy record player here? A couple of you. Okay. Aren't you going to be engineers? One engineer. Two. Okay. Interesting.
I'm going to assume everybody here, by show of hands, knows who the Beatles are, right? Okay. All right, so share my experience going to a retail store. Go to a Saddlebrook, there's a Walmart. I go in there, it's a Sunday, go to the music department, and I wanted to buy the Beatles #1. You know, that's the complete anthology of all their music videos and their #1 hits. And asked the young man behind the counter, he said, "The music's over there." Okay, so I go to the wall, there's not any Beatles CDs, nothing, nothing, Sgt. Pepper, nothing. So I come back, he's not there, and there's some other person there, and she directs me, and the guy comes back, and I said, "Listen, I'm looking for the Beatles CD, DVD combo, it's called #1s. Well, the music's over there." I said, "Yeah, I didn't see it." He walks over there, he goes, I guess we don't have it. I said, "Is it on a," there was big displays Sony had set up for some of their artists. So I said, "Well, is it maybe a display somewhere else in the store?" He said, "The Beatles." Is he a singer? It's quite discouraging.
Well, this actually, I was giving a talk to a bunch of old fogies in Princeton last week, and there was a universal consensus that music today is not as good as it was in the 70s. And I'm wondering, what do you think, and then what do you guys think about that? Do you think it's as good now as it was, or did you go back and listen? Do you think the old stuff is better?
It's just different.
How?
It's just it's like, I mean, you don't hear just raw instruments anymore.
Uh-huh.
It's not just like, yeah, it's not drum set, guitar, bass, and a singer. It's,
Local rock and roll created.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, rap is pretty good, though. You don't think it's as good as rock? How many people here think rap is as good as rock, like holistically? One. A few. And how many people think rap is? Does anybody think rap is just better than rock? They're like, this is better. You think so? And how many people think rock is better? Rock was better than rock is kind of dying. We agree, right? Like rock is kind of dying out. We're not sure. Okay. How many people think rock is better than rap? Interesting.
It's also different.
Are you talking about like rap now?
Yeah.
Like,
Or just the whole, starting from Sugar Hill Gang to today, the whole thing. It's very different.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, rock from frickin' Albert King to, Nirvana is a lot, right? It's a lot of different things going on there. What happened, and this is the point that you're getting at, is, live instrumentation is dying, both across the entire music industry spectrum and being replaced by Ableton Live and song sequencing. So, do you guys study that stuff? Do you study like Pro Tools and all? The guy who I was meeting with, Seabrook, you guys know who Max Martin is?
Well, John Seabrook was here.
Oh, Seabrook was here.
He spoke.
Oh, I spoke
He
with
sat in
Seabrook
that
in
chair.
Princeton. Okay, great. So Seabrook and Max Martin, and they do all that comping stuff. So essentially, I mean, Max Martin's actually a very talented musician. He can play several instruments, and he's got a beautiful singing voice. Not a lot of people know this about him. But his real musical talent is just moving things ever so slightly around in Ableton Live. I mean, that's what makes the big money, if you can believe it.
So all this piracy stuff really was enabled by technology.
Yeah.
So can we go back and talk about the evolution of the MP3?
Sure. So what happened was, very early on, the compact disc was introduced. People often criticize the music industry for failing to make the leap to digital, but this is not quite correct because they were the first industry to go completely digital. And they did it very, very early in 1982. They switched from a mode of vinyl analog platters to these compact discs, which essentially were just streams of ones and zeros. So you guys probably are too young to remember this, but almost the first digital device that anybody owned in their home was a compact disc player. I mean, probably more or less. Before they owned a personal computer or anything else, they bought a compact disc player. But these German guys were looking at this thing, and as I said before, they looked at it and they thought it was inefficient. And instead what they wanted to do, and this is 1982 they had this idea, let's take the bits off the compact disc and put them in a computer. And then what we'll have people do is we'll have them pick up their telephones, the old telephone, and they'll have a catalog, almost like a karaoke catalog of the song they want to hear. And then what they'll do is they'll punch the number off the catalog into their touch-tone phone, and then they'll hook the phone up to like a special receiver we designed that will pipe the music out of the phone into their stereo system. And this is the new model that we'll use to distribute music, and we'll get rid of the manifold inefficiencies of this whole physical distribution chain. 1982, they had this idea. And the guy actually filed for a patent on it. But his patent was rejected. And the reason is that a compact disc, as those of you who are doing the engineering side of it know, takes about 1.4 million bits to encode a second of stereo sound. And the telephone could only do it at about 128,000 kilobits per second. Or sorry, 128 kilobits per second. So there just were way too many bits, and they had to figure out a way to shrink this stuff by 90%. So he deputized a genius to do it. This guy, Karl-Heinz Brandenburg, who had multiple talents, disciplines in mathematics, engineering. He's a real math genius. He's about 6'5", and he's got basically Asperger's, and he sort of goes like this when he talks to you, and he's really awkward and tells a bunch of terrible jokes. But he's a brilliant man. And so for 5 years, he worked on this problem and eventually recognized that the ear has certain failings. Part of a discipline of academics called psychoacoustic analysis. Basically, if I have a tone at, let's say, 440 hertz and a second tone at 450 hertz, they will start to cancel each other out. The ear can't actually perceive the difference between those things very well. So the amount of bits that naively I would think I would need the same amount of bits for both those tones. But what Brandenburg figured out is that I can delete most of those bits because of the interference pattern between two tones. And there were other things they did. If I'm listening to a song and there's a drum beat, the first few milliseconds after the drum beat, my ear is still adjusting to the drum beat. So every time on a 4/4 beat, as I'm encoding the music, the period right after the drum beat, I don't actually have to use very much information to do that. And we can get rid of some bits there. Using these techniques and a variety of others, he was actually able to compress this down to about 128,000. And then what happened was one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of sort of the production side of music, was that he was utterly unable to sell this thing to anybody. He took it to BMG, which BMG's still around, or the Bertelsmann Music Group. I think they're part of...
no, they're a big company in Germany.
They're a big company in Germany. Here they're part of Sony, I think. Anyway, one of the big ones. He took it to Sony. He took it to a bunch of people, and they all rejected it. And that was because one thing was that the engineers all hated it. They had spent their lives constructing these perfect quality, high fidelity audio masters. And then this lanky German dork shows up and says, I'm going to delete 90% of your life's work. And they just didn't want to hear it, right? They weren't about it. And it's true, there was some, how many people here think they can hear a quality difference between like a wave master and an MP3? Do you guys think you can hear it or not?
The engineers.
The engineers definitely think they can.
Yeah.
And it's true. The average person, when they do listening studies, can't hear it. But if you get a seasoned studio engineer, they can always pick it up. So there is a difference. But
unless you have a Beats headphone.
Unless you have Beats headphones, right? Well, yeah, sure. That's a different story.
Right.
How many people here have Beats headphones? Anybody? You're embarrassed to admit it. No, he's got it. How many people here would spend more than $300 on a pair of headphones? I want to know.
The engineers.
A couple of you. Okay. Where was I? Oh, so he shrinks this stuff, he's trying to sell it to the music industry, and they won't take it. And meanwhile, he's got a competing technology by a rival group called the MP2, which some of you may or may not remember. And that ends up being the industry standard. There was a very famous war in the 80s over videotapes, the VHS versus Betamax battle. And the MP3 was the Betamax of audio compression. So in 1995, really in desperation, he posts it online for free, for public download, via a program called, like an idea called shareware, thinking basically that he's toast, that he's lost this battle. And soon enough, these basement pirates find it and they realize the potential of the thing, that they can get a compact disc and shrink it by 90% with only minimal losses in audio quality. So they start out doing this by the first single that ever got ripped to MP3 illegally was a Metallica song called Until It Sleeps. But the one that was really a big hit, I don't know if you guys will remember the song, was by Eazy-E, the song Real Mother G's. Does anyone remember this song? It was a big hit in like 1994. What they did was they took Real Mother G's and they compressed it to MP3, and then they copied it to 4 3.5-inch floppy disks, because this was really before broadband. They didn't have broadband yet. Then they took those disks and wrapped them up with tape and sent them to each other in envelopes in the mail. That was the earliest form of real digital music piracy.
Are you saying that the first use of MP3s was by pirates?
They had sold it in limited instances to other technology firms. And the thing is, okay, so the MP3 inventors ended up making a ton of money off this thing. Because even to this day, when you go and look at the license agreements on iTunes and on your iPod and everything, and even on Spotify, you go down to the licensing agreements, Fraunhofer's in there, the guys who invented this. They're still getting paid for this. So anything that compresses audio has to license this patent from them. But the irony there is that intellectual property licensing fortune that they made was only possible through the greatest wave of copyright infringement that the world had ever seen, right? So their gain came at a massive loss to artists and labels. So the MP3 had seen limited uses before, but without piracy, it never would have been successful.
And piracy would not have been successful without MP3s.
Probably not. No, probably
Not to the extent.
It's hard to imagine if the industry in '95, because the funny thing was there were guys who hated the compact disc. The first time they debuted the compact disc in the music industry, the guys booed it. You know, they were all vinyl guys and they were resistant to change. And then they introduced something in the late '70s and early '80s called the dual head cassette tape deck, which you could take your one cassette and then you could copy it to another cassette. And this actually led to an explosion of what was called home taping.
Home taping is killing music.
Home taping is killing music, which had a
Skull and crossbones.
logo of a cassette tape deck and then a crossbones under, a skull and crossbones under it. So it was a cassette tape with a crossbones that was later appropriated by the Pirate Bay as their logo. So law of unintended consequences there. And when that had happened, and they lost about, on an inflation-adjusted basis, basically like 50% of their sales from the sort of peaks, the very high peaks of '75 and '76, down to the real doldrums of 1982. Two things happened in 1982. One, they got away from album-oriented rock, and they started to really embrace single-oriented pop. And they really and then the Thriller came out that same year. And then two, the compact disc premiered, and they realized how profitable it was, and they realized that they could use it to save their asses. I don't know why it took them so long to come to that realization again with streaming, but now I think anybody you talk to in the music industry is thinking, they're thinking about streaming and they're thinking 10 or 20 years ahead. My impression from talking to all these guys is they learned their lesson the hard way, and they will never make this mistake again. They'll make some other mistakes, but they won't ever make this sort of bury your head in the sand and ignore the new technology mistake again. And a lot of industries won't make that mistake again. Journalists had the same problem.
I think when you talked about the compression, I think that's still something that I know the broadcast engineers still dibble around with right now, because they're always trying to find how they can get more information in a certain amount of bandwidth, and what frequencies they can take out that is not discernible to the average human ear.
You asked about early uses of the MP3. One of the first was digital audio broadcasting for multicast. So if you've ever have an HD radio signal, if you've ever used this, you'll know that there's like 93.1 and then there's 93.1-2 and -3. So that's those -2 and -3 channels were some of the first. That was like 94 and 95. The other guys who used it very early was the National Hockey League. They were the first the first North American customer of the MP3 in 95. They used it to broadcast interviews from the stadiums back to the radio station. And they invented something called a Zephyr box,
Oh,
which used MP3. Do you remember this?
yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the first uses of MP3 encoding.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah.
Zephyr. So while all this is going on, there's technology being developed. There's the pirates are like scrambling around. What's going on with the record labels? I mean, they're just sitting by and going, what are we going to do? I mean, obviously there were. I mean, the story goes that well, Doug Morris was the kingpin of the industry at that point. He was the executive. Here's a man who started with a small independent label, worked his way up managing Atlantic Records, oversaw the Warner thing, got booted out of there,
Right.
got hired by Edgar Brofman to start another label with Seagram's money, which evolved and morphed into what's known as Universal, which was formerly MCA, which laughably at the time was called MCA, was called Music Cemetery of America. That's how bad things were. And he got there, changed it from MCA to Universal. And then when they told him he was too old, he had to retire, he moved over to Sony. So here's a man who arguably has run the three majors that are still standing today.
He's run all three majors.
Yeah.
He's now 70. He was born in 1938, so he'll turn 78 this year. His most notable recent hits were he put out that Daft Punk album. He did the Beyonce Surprise album. He signed Miley Cyrus, and he did Adele last year. So he's still killing it.
And you mentioned Meghan Trainor.
And Meghan Trainor.
L.A. Reid works for him.
L.A. Reid still works for him, and they've been in, I think, business for 30 years.
They
now or
did
something.
business over at Universal, and now when he brought him over to Sony.
Morris's best friend is Jimmy Iovine. I assume you guys know who that is, the Beats impresario. They're actually on opposite sides of the fence now, but they still talk like constantly. I mean, like multiple times a day. When I interviewed Morris, Jimmy Iovine called him 4 times in 1 hour. So they're constantly on the phone with each other, and they're just like two old Brooklyn Sharpies, right? They're just like, Iovine was the son of a longshoreman, and
Right.
yeah.
But Doug, if I'm not mistaken, well, Doug was a songwriter.
So Doug, as a high schooler, saw Elvis Presley on TV. That's how old he is. He saw that happen live in real time, and decided he wanted to be a musician. He played the piano. You've heard his music. I've never heard it. It's not good.
Well, it's
Anyways,
back in the 50s.
Back in the 50s. He described it to me as more closer to Bobby Darin than Bob Dylan. So if you know who Bobby Darin is, he wrote a song called Splish Splash. I was taking a bath. So not great. Not great.
But you gotta remember, Doug co-wrote "Smoking in the Boys' Room,"
He got a couple hits.
and there was a big hit way before anybody in this room was born called "Are You a Boy, Are You a Girl?"
Are You a Boy, Are You a Girl? And he did another one for the Chiffons called
Sweet Talking.
Sweet Talking Guy.
Yeah.
So he had a few hits as a songwriter, but he moved into management pretty quickly. I think he saw, the songwriter's existence is pretty tenuous. It's very difficult. If any of you are trying to be songwriters, it's very difficult right now. Is anyone here trying to be an A&R? Couple of you.
I enter an A&R right now.
You intern it.
Yeah, at RCA.
It's all. Is it all data analytics now?
No, I mean there's separate executives for that. So
Okay.
like there's an analytics representative, but then you have the kind of like the guy who, I mean that's what I do too, just sit on blogs and actually look all over the internet and listen to just all these different sites and
How many
SoundClouds.
SoundCloud tracks do you listen to?
I can't even count.
Yeah, 1,000.
Yeah.
Huh.
And then there's the other side of they also have the side that works with the current artists. That's who formats the album and stuff like that. So
So what happens if you find something that you think is interesting or worthy? You bring it to the attention of one of your.
well, I have to put out 2 charts a week. So.
When you say
I mean,
charts,
I put like reports and charts. So like if I find something that's worth listening to, I'll put it out in like a daily report, and then if it's like something that they really should put some time into, I'll put it in it's a weekly report. So it's kind of more of a bigger picture.
so what happens to those reports?
The staff reviews them. And if they
So
find
has
something-
anything that you've found, has anybody
Yeah, you
responded,
found
come
Fetty
back to you?
Wap on,
You get any
on
feedback?
SoundCloud, yeah.
You get any feedback?
I mean, yeah, I get some decent feedback. A lot of the times they've already touched on things that I found. They're all.
We know about that.
Yeah. And then I've had 2 artist pitches so far. So like somebody I really feel passionate about, and then I just kind of pitch it to the staff.
Oh.
But nothing really came of my first one. So.
You know how Scooter Braun found Justin Bieber
Yeah.
off YouTube? He accidentally clicked the link.
Right.
Did you know that? That's how Justin Bieber became famous. A music manager accidentally clicked a link on YouTube.
He's doing pretty good.
Yeah.
He's doing.
But in the old days, right?
He's managing Kanye West now.
Yeah. There was no internet, right? In the old days, you had to go scout these smoky-ass bars and juke joints. You read about the history of the industry. Ahmet Erdogan wandering into the black part of town when this was a time when people wouldn't cross over, and finding Ray Charles at some crappy old dive bar like way back in the hills. That's how you used to do it before there was the internet. And Morris sort of came from that era, right? But he very early on decided that was not how he was going to play it. So he did some scouting of live acts, he did some scouting of new musicians, he did some auditions. But what he really did was he hung out in the back office, and he kept very careful records of where the LPs were being shipped across the country. And if he saw something that seemed to be moving, like a blip or turning a little heavier. Remember, there's no internet now. He's looking at physical retail spreadsheets. He would say, hey, maybe we've got something here. His first gold record was a totally forgettable song by a band called the Music Explosion. And what he realized was that they were selling a bunch of records in one market in Cumberland, Maryland. So he calls the guy at the record store and he says, what's going on? He's like, well, we've got a local DJ who loves a song and he's playing in rotation, and it's moving records. So he goes back to his boss and he says, we got to move this. We got to take it out of local rotation and put it national. And this is his core philosophy, because there's no such thing as a regional hit. Okay? There's only a global hit that we haven't marketed yet. If something can hit regionally, then we can sell it to everybody. And that worked. That worked. The song went to #2 and he went gold. 30 years later, one of his A&Rs comes to him and says, yeah, I was hanging out in a record store in New Orleans, and they have these guy named Birdman and Slim, and they're outselling Tupac Shakur, in New Orleans. I'm not sure how they're doing it. So he calls the guys over. Birdman comes in, and he can't understand him because his accent's so thick. So he's running Cash Money Records, and he's giving him this distribution deal for all these artists. Nobody else would listen to these guys, but Morris was like, yeah, you've got it. You've got Juvenile, Lil Wayne, and Birdman. I see the vision of it, and most importantly, you've proven you can sell records in New Orleans. And if you can sell records in New Orleans, I think you should, even though your New Orleans accent is so thick that I can barely comprehend what you're saying, I think you can sell records anywhere. And they did. It became the most successful independent label of all time. So this is his mentality, and he's still doing this.
And he passes that tradition along to the most successful record label right now is Republic, which is Monty
Right.
Littman.
Right.
And he taught Monty how to do that.
And he trained Lucian Grange, who's
Yep.
who's now in charge at Universal. The difference now is that he doesn't have to go hang out in the record store anymore. He doesn't have to go to a bar. He doesn't have to hang out in the back office. In an instant, he can pull. Spotify acts like a massive electronic spying device, essentially, that focuses on what everyone's listening to. And, there's a variety of different third-party data applications that will tell him exactly what's trending. So you said
But everybody else too.
tell everybody else too. So then it becomes a data analytics game where you're looking at, okay, this SoundCloud guy is, and by the way, I haven't even listened to this person's music. It doesn't matter, but I can see the SoundCloud song spiking. I honestly think it's possible that for a good data analytics guy, if he was deaf, he could do the job. I literally think that's now possible. I think you could be an A&R and you wouldn't be able to hear. I think you could pull it off.
Probably right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So that's the contemporary state of the industry. Now, the flip side of that is, and I'm writing about this now, what does that mean for consumers? Are we all just, sort of pawns in this large-scale data analytics game? Are we individuals at all? Does our taste matter? Or, does if you're trying to be a music industry executive, does it even matter what you like?
But it begs the question, artists may mean something to some of you here, maybe not. But when Warner's was always known for artist development, and they would take an artist, whether it was a Bonnie Raitt or a Fleetwood Mac, they would stay with them for 5, 6, 7 albums before they would even possibly achieve any sort of gold status.
Right.
Today, I don't think that opportunity is going to exist for any band. If you don't make it on your first single,
If you don't make it on your first few albums, I think you actually have to rebrand.
single, forget album.
Yeah.
You're not even you're not going to get an album until you have a single.
You have to change your. Katy Perry got 2 shots, and that was huge. That was massive. Like most people get 1 shot at most. So if you slump out of the gate in today's market, you're essentially toast. Now it's not true with the indie labels. You can carve out
Right.
some kind of career, and there's people who do break a little bit later, but for the most part, you're right. I'm trying to think of someone like Father John Misty, who got very big last year. That was his 8th or 9th album, but he changed his name and completely reinvented his musical sound to do it. I think Yo Gotti has been before the Down in the DM. He's been hanging around as a rap musician for 14 years or something, and he's been growing in stature very slowly. But it's not like some big label was encouraging him. He finally just refused to stop grinding and finally had a hit, like a big radio hit.
But they're still artists, and if they accept that they're now on their own label or an independent label, they can continue making a living because, as you and I discussed earlier before class, is the way musicians make money today is radically different than it was back in the 70s. You put out an album, it got some airplay, then you could go on the road and tour, and maybe you got a publishing deal, maybe you sell some merch, and maybe if you got lucky, somebody might want to use your song in some commercial vehicle. That's all upside down now. I mean, the record is a lost leader. You give it away almost because you're not going to see any money if you get an advance from the label.
Right.
That's that. You're making your money on the road. Musicians say make money on the road touring, publishing, sync licenses, and merchandise.
And then you get paid to put a Ciroc vodka bottle in your video. Yeah.
Although when MTV was around, you couldn't get away with that.
couldn't get away with it. No.
They'd make you edit that out.
No, I think for the mid-tier musician, it's all about touring, and even for the big musician, it's got to be mostly
even
touring
before
money.
you want to get signed.
Yeah.
How are you going to generate income on the interest on the internet unless you're a touring entity?
Mm-hmm. And then getting found now happens. It's typically via a commercial. You reach a much wider audience to be in a commercial or on a TV show. So that stuff, artists will often give it away for very low. I mean, they'll get paid, but getting featured in like a Apple commercial can change your career. And it was not that way in the old days. People would refuse to license their music to commercials.
So how do executives like a Doug Morris, like a Lucien Grange, how do they maintain the financial arrangements that they've grown up living when we've gone from a album economy to a song economy? So you're going from a $16, $17 item down to $1.
Well, you've heard about the 360 deal. You guys familiar with this? And this is very controversial. Drake has one. So essentially, Cash Money or his label gets a cut of every income source that he gets. I don't know if you guys, there was like a diss track that Pusha T put out of Drake. I don't know how up you are in the contemporary rap feuds, but this is one of the things he was referring to, what a bad contract actually Drake has. And this is one of the reasons. Drake can go on tour and Birdman's getting a cut of his tour revenue, right? It's not like the old days. Now that artists' album sales don't mean that much, there's been a lot of push towards this. Morris, interestingly, resisted this. He didn't like these deals, but it
Right.
seems to be really the way the industry is going.
And by the way, the Cash Money deal which was Doug made it at Universal, was a distribution and pressing
Right.
and distribution. So Universal only gets X amount of.
I think 15% of the total thing. Yeah,
Right.
that's why Birdman's one of the richest. But he has like $200-300 million. Also, he doesn't
Cash.
pay. Yeah,
Cash.
he doesn't pay anybody either. Like all of his rappers
artists.
defect and sue him. You know, like he's kind
Wayne,
of
like Wayne right now.
Yeah. Wayne is now suing him over I think like years and maybe even decades of lost revenue. Wayne got signed to Cash Money by calling Birdman's answering machine when he was 12 years old and rapping into it.
And then he got put into the Hot Boys.
And they got put in the Hot Boys. That's how he got picked up. So
But I
that's awesome.
suppose we'd not be fair if we didn't talk about Jay-Z and Rock Nation.
Right.
Because that's a whole other way he's done a whole other thing there.
Right. I know less about that, I guess. What is the?
No, I mean, he's got a management company. He's
Oh,
got
yeah.
a label. He signs artists. And
Well, he
you're
sees
not
himself
you're not
as
hearing people.
you know, like part of a diverse. He's got his agency. He's got sports agents, I think. Yeah,
Yes,
he
he
sees
does.
himself as part of a diversified business empire. Does that work? Is that working for him? I don't actually know.
It seems to be.
Okay.
It seems to be. I mean, he has Rihanna.
Here's Rihanna.
He's always got something going.
He's always got
And
something.
you don't hear complaints.
He's got
about
Tidal.
paying.
Well, Tidal. Do you guys think Tidal? Does anyone here subscribe to Tidal? One. You're a Kanye fan. No, you just Jay-Z and Beyonce. Interesting. No, so there's one Tidal subscriber in this whole room. Wait, that's not very promising. You know, it's funny what Kanye just did
Right.
was brilliant, I think. Kind of releasing this album that it sounds like he's going to continuously update for the rest of eternity. What he's doing there is he's copying. So video games had a massive problem with piracy and they still do, but it was really bad in the mid-2000s. And eventually they moved away from a model of selling you a physical product into a box, and instead you buy the video game and then it's updated in patch release cycles over and over and over again. It's essentially into eternity. So if you don't have the authorized product, like it's not really worth very much. So you sort of have to buy the real thing. You know, it seems like that is what Kanye is attempting to do with The Life of Pablo. Musically, for me, I don't know if it's there. But maybe you guys like it more than me. But it's an interesting concept. I don't know. Maybe it'll work.
All right. I want to go to some of the class questions, if
Oh,
that's
sure.
okay
Yeah,
with you.
let's hear.
So Yolanda was asking a question.
Which one's Yolanda? Hi.
There we go. So do you think if Sean Fanning wouldn't have created Napster, streaming wouldn't be dominating the music industry today? Or do you believe that streaming would have eventually come with or without Napster?
It definitely was coming. There was no escaping it. Just in the same way that, you know, physical retail stores are being destroyed by Amazon anyway. You know, we're moving to a digital lifestyle, digital model. You know, just as legally we have Instagram destroying the classic sort of photo blog or whatever. That's just the contemporary trend. Fanning was 18, and he wrote 80,000 lines of code. He was basically younger than some of you when he came up with Napster. And he saw the extraordinary potential of what was going on in the campus file sharing thing. Anybody, he wasn't a genius. Anybody with a reasonably decent computer programming skills could have done this. Okay, he was just the first to get on it, and he had to be 18 because if you tried to do it when you're 28, you'd start thinking, "Oh, who do I have to ask to do this? What's my lawyer going to say? Which licenses do I have to get to make this a real business?" Right? Trust me, this is how you'll think when you're 28. And when you're 38, you'll think even more like this. You're like, how am I going to get sued? But because he was 18, it just never occurred to him. He just didn't, he had that kind of wide open, way of thinking about things. And so he could break the record industry essentially because all of the guys in the boardroom were like, "Oh, who do we have to ask to make this work? Who do I have to go? Where are the lawyers? Who do I have to talk to?" And Fanning didn't do that, right? And eventually, it destroyed him. His business was sued out of existence. But by that time, the proof of concept was out there, and ultimately, it destroyed the industry instead.
Another question from Yolanda, I think it's worth discussing, is in your book we learn how Dell became an addict when it came to sharing the content in his online groups. If he hadn't become so hooked, do you believe he would have ever gotten caught?
Yeah, he almost got away with it, to be honest. All of these guys, they actually felt that the heat was on them. They knew the FBI was after them, and they were they were constantly talking about retiring and going out with like one big score. They had a server called Fatal Error that was run in like essentially like a black site in Hungary, and the authorities seized it in January of 2007. And they said, we're getting too close, we're shutting down this group. The name of the group was Rabid Neurosis, that was leaking all the albums. And they all quit. And so essentially they all walked away scot-free. But Glover was addicted to the money he was earning from his DVD piracy trade, and he didn't want to give it up. You know, he was buying all sorts of ridiculous shit. He had like a quad bike, he had ATVs, he bought a bunch of handguns. He took his family to Disney World, paid off his girlfriend's loans, a bunch of stuff. So he wanted the money. And the controller of the group, this guy Kali, the stoner who lived with his mom in California, he was addicted too. He had some sort of dark compulsion to keep doing this. So even after they shut the group down, the three of them and a few other Confederates very quietly continued to leak albums. And that's actually when they leaked 50 Cent and Kanye West. Those two leaks right in a row, they were caught the next day. That's how they finally got him, because they managed to flip one of the members of the group, and he testified against all of them. But if they'd walked away when they thought they were going to, and when they'd first agreed to, they probably never would have been caught, and we wouldn't know about any of this. So I think that addiction, you know, I was telling you, he still has it. So he's out of prison. He's off parole. He works as a technician, like a maintenance man at the Freightliner truck manufacturing facility in North Carolina. So he's essentially like an auto worker, a union auto worker. But his side business is he buys from China these cheap commodity computers for like, you know, for $1,000 you get 20, so $50 a computer. He wipes Windows off of them and installs this open source home theater operating system called Kodi. Now, if you know what you're doing with this thing, then you can go online and connect it to these shadow pirate streaming networks. And this is the contemporary frontier of piracy, that are sort of like Netflix if Netflix was free and they had every single movie ever. So you buy one of these set-top boxes, you hook it up to your TV, and Glover will sell it to you for $150, $150. And then you sort of go online to wherever, there's some dark net site that's going to stream you illegally movies. And in the past 3 months or so, or in one 3-month period, Glover made $45,000 in cash selling these set-top piracy boxes. But he thinks it's legal because he's not doing any pirating, right? He's just selling you an open source computer with Linux installed on it. What you end up doing with it, if you want to connect to the pirate site, that's not really his problem, right? So, you know, I described him as the man who destroyed the record industry to put rims on his car. But now he's gotten really into fishing, so he's the man who's destroying Netflix to buy a pontoon boat.
Well, Ronette.
Who's Ronette? Hi.
Hi. So Ronette's asked, the question is, what are your feelings on the RIAA's decision to include streamed CD sales in the recognition of album certification?
Oh, I think it's great. Look, the whole platinum thing, I mean, I know it means a lot to artists, but it was always kind of bullshit. A lot of it was fake. A lot of it was always dodgy numbers anyway. I mean, what does it mean to go platinum if you're not including streams? It's meaningless. I think that whole system should be redesigned, I think. I'm not sure what kind of recognition they can get, but I know, like, if you get 100 million streams, you should get, I don't know, something in the mail, right, from the RIAA, something nice, right, like a gift basket. I don't know.
All right.
Well, what do you think? I don't know. What do you think about it?
I don't know. That's why I asked the question.
Okay. She wants fruit basket.
Do a fruit basket. Look, it's funny. You get 100 million streams, let's say, on Spotify. You don't actually make that much money. I mean, you make a decent amount, but it's not as much as you would think. You know, you're probably bringing home 700 grand. Is that right? 7/10 of a cent per play. Did I just do the math right? I think so. You make 1 million off 1 cent, so $700,000, and that's at the label level. Okay, so that's the whole chunk of change that Spotify is paying out to the entire. So then you got to pay your engineer, you got to pay your producer.
Recoupment.
Yeah, recoup. You got to recoup your advance, songwriter, label. You know, your agent, your manager, your lawyer. They all get points somehow. So, that's why the guy from Portishead was complaining. He's like, yeah, I had like 100 million streams. I got a $9 check or something. It was absurd, So it's tough. So maybe they shouldn't include it. I don't know, but they should get some kind of recognition. The problem is that what's that? A fruit basket. A fruit basket sounds great. Who's going to say no, right?
Well, Billboard's starting to use that information in their charts also.
Well, the problem is they don't talk to each other, the streaming services. It's very fragmented. So there's nothing quite like SoundScan or anything that's going to tell you, okay, Tidal stream this, Apple Music stream this, and Spotify stream this.
So somebody in this room will have to develop a streaming chart.
Someone here will have to develop that. Could be nice.
There's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Have you heard of Buzz Angle?
No.
Buzz Angle is that new. I just met them over the weekend. They're started by a guy and another guy who left SoundScan, created their new company, and they have this thing called Buzz Angle that is better interface, everything better than SoundScan, and it's supposed to be more accurate than.
Interesting. Nielsen is like totally dated. That's a different, but they own SoundScan now, right? Yeah.
Yep. All right, let's go to Zach Smith. And Zach asked the question.
Zach here? Did he leave? I guess he got bored.
Zach's hiding?
Well, let's ask this question.
That's a good question anyway. Considering the fact that musicians barely make any money off of record sales in the first place, is it really detrimental to the success of a musician if people are listening to their music for free?
No, I don't think so. It especially helps you, think about The Weeknd, who started giving away his music for free on SoundCloud and various sites, then got a major label deal, took the exact same music and repackaged it as the trilogy. It was already available for free online. I think he sold about 1 million copies of it. So the fact that it was already completely available for free didn't stop him from physically selling more of it. And so especially if you're just starting out, it's a great model. Now certain people, heavyweights, Adele, can sell 7 million albums. If you look at who's selling albums, there's Adele, which is like this, and there's like everyone else combined. So one person is still selling albums. So how does she do it? Adele's fan base demo is different. It tends to be older, it tends to be more female, and they tend never to have been pirates in the first place, and less interested in technology. So they're still actually buying her album on compact disc. It's one of the reasons Taylor Swift could get away with it too, because she's still selling so many physical compact discs at the mall, right, at Walmart. But that's a legacy business that's dying out. So I think for the most part, you're going to have to give something away for free, especially at the beginning of your career.
Is Natalia here?
Hi.
Okay, so a question she asked was, you mentioned how music piracy became to the early 2000s what drug experimentation had been to the late 1960s. Do you think this experimentation with rapidly emerging technology was an inevitable response to the increasing cost of media?
No, because they got away with ripping everybody off for years, and nobody really started bootlegging physically. What I think happened, you guys, I feel bad for you because you missed the period of the internet where it was just like the Wild West. It was just a frickin' free-for-all out there for a while. What had happened was that the PC evangelists in the early 80s and even late 70s were like, we have this new tool that is going to democratize production, and we're going to leave it completely open, and anybody can do anything they want. They can share information and communicate and produce without any boundaries. They really had a utopian vision about what it could and should be. And so as that started to make its way into people's hands, one of the first things that they realized immediately they loved pornography, and so a lot of pornography got on the internet. And they realized that they loved to, illicitly copy and share files. And that stuff flooded the internet. And that was the public doing it. That was the public internet with their open PCs. Well, it was great for the technologists, but it was catastrophic for the sort of classic media rights holders. And they were at war for a period. Probably 1998 to 2006, they were just at war. Finally, YouTube came along, and when YouTube first started, it was just full of pirated content. Like in the very earliest days of YouTube, there were just whole movies that people would post up there. There were no rights, there was nothing. And Viacom sued them They sued YouTube and by extension Google, who bought YouTube. And they won this massive judgment for $1 billion. And at that point, I think Google started to say, the frontier is closing. People can't just post anything they want anywhere anymore. And so the technologists and the rights holders started to cooperate for the first time. And you see the results of that on the next wave of computing, which is the smartphone. Nobody talks about this open communication, free device, do whatever you want on the smartphone. It's a closed system, walled garden. You go in the app store, you get the pre-approved apps, and that's what you get to use. There's nothing like a torrent on it. And you couldn't run it even if you wanted to. There's nothing like Napster. So the paradigm of computing, I think, is really what caused this to happen, and that paradigm is now shifted. More than them ripping us off, which they did for years.
Well, going hand in hand with that, Miles asked a question that it's obvious that people wanted free music, but people seem not to care about putting their computers and information at risk with things such as hacking and virus. Do you feel that the downloaders are willing to take this risk for free music, or are most of them unaware of the dangers?
No, they didn't know the dangers. People got giving someone an unlicensed computer was like giving them a handgun with no training. Nobody knew it. People got in so much trouble on the internet so quickly, especially in the earliest days. Before there were regulations about how a car should be driven and you needed a driver's license and whatnot, in the earliest days of cars, people were just constantly plowing into each other and hitting pedestrians and stuff. It wasn't like you didn't need a driver's license.
So you personally had no
You went
fear in your computer?
I was a little more savvy. I think I was aware that hacking and viruses existed. And the real risk there you won was whenever you torrented, you were advertising your IP address for the subpoena-happy RIAA who could sue you and win a massive judgment against you for pirating. I talk about this a lot in the book, but in the mid-2000s, the RIAA ran a campaign called Project Hubcap, where they started just picking people off the file sharing sites and suing them at random. They were suing grandmothers, they were suing children, they sued some dead people. Just whoever was registered as the Internet Protocol address holder of record, that's who ended up getting served a lawsuit. They served 17,000 people this way, and almost all of the people either negotiated out or pleaded guilty and paid a small fine. One woman said, "No, I'm not going to take it. My daughter shared 24 songs on Napster, and you're saying that I owe you money? Screw you, I'm taking this to the court." She took it to jury trial. Her name is Jamie Thomas in Minnesota, and she lost. And the jury decided that she was liable for every song that she had infringed, and that she owed statutory damages to the record industry of $225,000 for sharing 24 songs. It's a landmark judgment. She appealed it all the way to the state Supreme Court, through the federal appeals court. The Supreme Court declined to hear it, and today that ruling stands. That's what she owes. She was bankrupted by the judgment. So that was a real risk. People were really running it, and they probably didn't know or think about it. Now, the odds that you get picked out are low. It's a low risk you're running, but it's there.
Joseph had a question. By capitalizing on ads with the YouTube videos, do you think Doug Morris was accepting the fact that the music had already escaped and became free?
Yeah, that was forced. He was forced into that position. I think for the first time, that was his moment watching his 12-year-old son listening to "In the Club" by 50 Cent, a song which he had commissioned essentially and paid for the video for. And then he sees it on YouTube or Yahoo Videos getting paid for free, and they're making money and he isn't. That was his wake-up call. Because he realized that his son wasn't even pirating music anymore. He wasn't even downloading files, that paradigm was leaving. The paradigm that I had been a part of and the paradigm that was coming in. So remember, I had said that, well, I had thought of music as, they thought of music as an inventory thing, but I thought of it as a computing thing. I think for you guys, it won't even feel like a computer. It'll feel like an omnipresent utility that you summon out of the air with a word command, right? It'll be like your sorcerers. You'll say something and music will start to play. I mean, we're there right now. If you buy an Amazon Echo, you can summon music into the air at a moment's notice. So the idea that it will even seem like a computer will stop. It'll just be magic, right? The ultimate mode of the internet will finally have happened when it's like electricity, when it's always on and you never ever think about it. And the idea of being without it seems absurd, like turning off the circuit breaker in your house. We're not quite there yet, but I think the generation to come will feel this way.
Samantha needs your help. She has a question that she gets into heated debates with personal friends who believe that intellectual property rights should not even exist. Despite her endless arguments and enlightening them on all the contents discussed in your book and other things, there still are some folks who don't believe that they should have to sit through ads to listen or watch content for free. Do you have a point that tends to silence the opposing side in these debates?
Is Samantha here? Hi. What is piracy and where does it come from? There used to be no concept of intellectual property until about the 18th century. And it came, before that, it was actually viewed as like flattering that someone would copy your work because it was so hard to reproduce something. After the invention of the printing press, what happened is that suddenly there were all these books around, and there hadn't been that previously. And so authors who had previously wanted to get their work into as many hands as possible now found that they were facing a problem of oversupply. And they began to lobby the government for the right to sort of artificially constrain the number of books that existed. Okay? And that's how what we call the copyright came into existence. And so there was a Dell Glover of the early 1700s, guys out in the sticks in England with illegal printing presses running off cheap copies of books and selling them for a profit. And that's actually where the word piracy come from. They called those people pirates, making an allusion they were similar to these maritime, buccaneers who were out raiding ships. That's how they thought of them. Pirate was like a really dirty word back then. It was like terrorist. So that's what they called them, essentially, like word terrorists. They're destroying our income. So they took an axe to the printing press and they chopped it up. Now, is that a good or a bad thing? I mean, it really depends on your perspective. For a rights holder to make money, they need to enforce artificial conditions of scarcity. They need to limit modes of production, and they need to make sure that not too much of one thing can exist. And I should say this is an old concept in other spheres. We understand intuitively that for money to have any value, we can't just make it in a printer in our house. Like only one person's allowed to make it, the government, right? And it's true in constraining supply in a number of other fields. The problem is, though, what happens when it starts to move into medicine, life-saving technology? They do the same thing, right? If I start illegally producing at a pharma company, a bunch of cheap life-saving medicine, the government will come and lock up my factory. Is that a good or a bad thing? I'm asking you. I don't even know. I see both sides of this argument. I can hardly, in good faith, say, no, don't pirate when I myself have pirated such an enormous amount of stuff. But my entire income essentially is based on the copyright from this book. Online, this book was pirated immediately. The audiobook was pirated 3,000 or 4,000 times, which to me was flattering. I liked the attention. But it cost me probably a little bit of money on the margin. The worst is there's these Russian book bootleggers who run a site called ebooks.wtf, who crack essentially library ebook holdings and copy them all and then sell them for profit. Okay, so they're essentially stealing from the library, recopying the information. You buy it via Bitcoin for like 80 to 90 cents. So you can also obtain my book by paying 90 cents for the ebook from a bunch of Russian book pirates. They're word terrorists. I don't know. I don't like it. I think that's wrong, what they're doing. I think, if you can make any kind of distinction between file sharing, which is not for profit, and straight up organized crime for profit bootlegging, I don't think it should exist. But it's an incredibly complex, morally tortured question. All
right. David has a lengthy question here.
Sure. I just gave a lengthy answer, so I deserve
Sorry.
it. Yeah.
So my parents always told me there are two things in the world people always have to pay for: music and alcohol.
Okay.
The difference being, though,
Who are your
alcohol.
parents?
The difference being that alcohol is a physical product, whereas music isn't anymore. Past speakers L.A. Reid and Barry Weiss told us that the major streaming companies are pushing the plot to pay for unlimited streaming, which may eventually cause free streamers like Spotify to only offer paying options for streaming. Do you think this is the only option to force people to pay for music like that? Or is there's no way for people to pay for music even when there are no free streaming services anymore?
I think eventually they will win. I think,
Win?
yeah, the streamers, I think they will successfully force almost everybody into a paid mode.
By the way, is that a win?
Well, I think the streamers will win.
Right.
I think they will win. I don't know what it means for the musicians, but I think the streaming companies will win. And again, it's the cooperation between the rights holders and the technologists. When they're working in concert, it's really hard for the average individual to oppose them. And they definitely have pushed both the labels and the technologists, all of their chips into the middle of the table on streaming. You know, Apple and Google both have streaming services also. They have $100 billion in cash on their balance sheet. They can lose money for years trying to get this to work and perfect it, and there's an enormous prize at the end that they can gain. So I just think that if you can imagine back in the 90s, people were putting out software and they said, "F the musicians." That is a direct quote from the chairman of Napster. Okay, I think it was some musician came to them and said, "I'll give you $1 million if you collaborate with me to put out my new album via Napster." And he said, "Fuck you and fuck your $1 million." That's not the attitude that any technology company has now. There was a different attitude back then. So they almost viewed them as a roadblock toward total domination. Now I think they play very nicely with each other. The technologists have started to adopt some of the elements of celebrity in their own lifestyle, and Steve Jobs really pioneered this. And the flip side of that is, of course, any celebrity is thinking about technology and how to profit off it. So there used to be a big separation between the nerds and their computers and these glamorous Hollywood types, and they've sort of morphed into one being now.
Speaking of Jobs and Apple, question here from Ariana. Do you feel Apple's monopoly on music is still positive, or are you glad there are competing streaming services?
Oh, I think it's great there's competing services. The big problem on the horizon, I think, is that the streaming services themselves will begin to degrade in quality in terms of what's available on them. Netflix, this is already happening. If you guys are longer-term Netflix subscribers, you'll know over the last 5 years that their catalog has gone from decent to pretty horrible. It's actually pretty hard to find something you want to watch on Netflix, and that didn't used to be the case. And this isn't just my impression. There's quantitative studies that show the size of their catalog shrinking every year as rights holders wake up to the power that they hold over them. So right now, Netflix costs about $10 a month and has about 5% of what you'd ever want to watch. Spotify costs $10 a month and has about 95% of what you'd ever want to hear. I see that number, the 95%, going down a lot over the next few years. I think a lot of artists are moving to exclusives. They're pulling their stuff off Spotify. I see bidding wars erupting, or maybe not bidding wars, but wars for control of artists' catalog erupting between the major streaming services. I suspect, though, right now, it's actually a pretty even playing field between Spotify, Apple Music, and maybe Tidal's like a distant third. Google may have something in there that might be. YouTube is a very powerful player quietly in a way that people don't fully understand. But that's actually how most people listen to music. I think in the future, this market will end up being dominated by two or maybe even one player. I just see that that's the direction it may end up going in. The other model is that it'll be a free-for-all with dozens of players, sort of like Hulu, Netflix, HBO Go, Vimeo, dozens of services, all sort of competing, maybe trying to carve out a niche, and each of them has like an exclusive content library that's different than the next one. It could go there too. I think that would be a negative outcome. I don't think I'd be very happy with my music listening experience if I had to remember oh, is Kanye West on Tidal? And where's Taylor again? Is she on Spotify or is she on Google Music? Where is she? Like, I have to go search through like 4 services. That doesn't sound like very much fun.
What's fascinating with Taylor is where she fought with Apple, iTunes,
Yeah.
and now she's got a commercial. I don't know if any of you seen the commercial with Taylor, where she's on the
I'm
treadmill.
I'm a Taylor truther. I think that's all. I think that's all conspiracy to promote her. I'm just kidding.
Well, no, it's very possible.
It's possible. It all worked perfectly for her, didn't it? Yeah.
It sure did,
Yeah, it made her
conveniently.
look great, and then it made them look like heroes or something for a second. Yeah.
Bianca asks the question. Bianca? You think if the music industry was more active when music started being pirated, we would all be paying for streaming services instead of being able to stream for free?
Yeah, so what if some guy, and if there were people who did this actually, but what if some guy in 1995 had got up on a table at the conference room at Rising Tide or Sony, and maybe you saw somebody do this and been like, look, we're all f***ed. We got to invest heavily in this internet right now, okay, or we're all going to lose all of our money. And let's just imagine he convinced them, okay? He convinced the majors to put a $300 million slush fund to invest in new distribution technology, and everybody was on board, and they knew that the compact disc would be gone very soon. What would the world look like? I still think actually we'd be in a very bad space for musicians because, again, all that money they were, and this is why they were so, this is the real reason they were so resistant to do it. All that money they were earning off the dead weight from the album, right? The Blackstreet money that you get from selling the No Diggity CD when you just want to hear the No Diggity song. That money was making them wealthy and complacent, and they never ever wanted that to go away. Morris's big resistance towards digital sales always was that it would unbundle the single from the album, and then that disaggregation would hurt them. And he was right, and it did. But after a certain point, there was no going back. And so it had to happen. I just don't. Even if they'd gotten way in front of it, and some of them did. There's a guy named Thomas Middelhoff at Bertelsmann, BMG, who bought a stake in Napster and wrote it, down with the ship. And eventually ended up in jail, but for different reasons. But he believed in it, and to some extent, I think Edgar Bronfman Jr. wanted a stake too. At some point, he was negotiating for a stake.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So some of them tried, but I think the forces arrayed against them were. This is what I say about Morris. Even though he presided over the destruction of the empire, it's not like he did something that wrong. That you can't point to anybody who did a good job during this, right? You can't point to any music company label or executive and say, oh yeah, they really nailed it. They really saw the future there. If there was even one guy, like one small indie label who had it figured out and was making a ton of money off of this, I think you could make that argument, but there's no one.
Kellen, I'm going to twist her question around a little bit. She wanted to know if the value of music, you think it'll ever rise again like it was before piracy. And then I want to say to you, though, do you think there's any way to fix the culture shift that has relegated music to what now is the back seat?
Oh, is that true?
Well, compared to where it was in the 60s and 70s, sure.
I don't think it's true. These people you guys love music. It means everything to them.
But you're not going to see the prime culture that you saw in the 60s where people would hang out in a record store, albeit there's no record store. They're more excited about going to hang out in the Apple store. You're not seeing music used as a cultural medium the way it was. And it may be just due to the fragmentation.
Okay, so first of all, that was an extraordinary period of time for a variety of reasons,
Right.
including there was a lot of civil unrest, there was a lot of political unrest, and there was a lot of drug experimentation for the first time, and people were really so there was a mass opening of the consciousness of what sort of the political system in life could look like, and music played a big role in that.
Right.
Had a real revolutionary potential that it does not have right now, but it could.
Only when presidential candidates use a song without permission.
Right, but it could. You could see someone like Kendrick Lamar developing into a more powerful cultural force with real impact. Politically, this generation, and my generation as well, is not as involved or committed as your generation was. partly because we're not being drafted, but for a variety of reasons, right? Like when I think about my dad, who was extremely politically active when he was young, I think a lot of that came from a fear that he was going to be forced involuntarily against his will to go die in a jungle in Vietnam. He presents it as, a political thing, but there was also real risk involved for him, and that drove people to get involved in the political arena. And they brought with them sort of acid and marijuana, and they also brought like an extraordinary sort of potentiality of what the music could be. We're not living in a very politically awakened time, I don't think. And so broadly our culture is, and the movies are worked too, I think. And we've handed a lot of power over to sort of corporate forces.
I guess the cultural similarity might be with EDM music at this point.
Yeah,
at least
maybe.
The festivals. I mean, I guess there's a lot.
But that stuff is a blast, and the music's good, but it's not.
But what goes on in those?
Maybe at Burning Man. I don't know.
Okay, Burning Man.
But Burning Man's very corporate too. It's just not there. There's no one's writing a song like Ohio. I mean, they are to some extent, but it doesn't have the same meaning somehow.
Right.
It's not a mass awakening that's happening.
But can there ever be a mass awakening ever again?
Oh yeah, it can. Yeah.
But the fragmentation of the media is going to be difficult to get
I
any
don't-
sort of mass.
There's still hits. There's still mega hits, and I think it's possible.
think?
I think so.
Okay.
I remember a lot of those guys. They didn't even want them on TV. Like some of them had, in the UK, they had to go on boats and broadcast offshore just to hear the music. So it's not like everyone was buying into it while it was happening.
That's true. Whole different direction. Joelle, right? So she wanted to know if you think vinyl is getting more popular, especially, why do you think vinyl is getting more popular, especially since digital music and streaming is so big?
I have no idea. I find vinyl records to be the most affected, pretentious thing on the planet. They're heavy and they smell bad and they scratch. Whatever the appeal, you'll have to tell me, because your generation buys a lot more records than mine ever did. So you'll have to. Do you buy them?
Yeah.
What do you like about
She likes
them?
the smell.
You like the smell?
No, I don't. I mean, my dad is 65, so like he grew up in the 70s, and like that was like a big part of his life, like vinyls. And I think for me personally, it was more of like, oh, Joelle, let's go to a vinyl shop and like look through stuff. So like we go to Princeton Records all the time, so I just love it, and I like the sound too.
Right. Okay. I mean, the sound is different. It's true. It has a slightly different quality. I guess I get it. I think what I think is happening is like there's a great video online where it shows like a desk, an office desk from the 1970s, and how every function of like the Rolodex and the frickin' stapler and paper clips and shit are all slowly consolidated into a single device, right? So your entire life is then sort of intermediated by it. And that leaves your house bare, right? It leaves desk space and bare and open. And so what remains is I described it in another piece as a phantom longing for physical objects, stuff that you can own and stuff that becomes a conversation piece to have with other people. It's also a nice way to show off your taste, which I'm sure is very sophisticated. And if you have a bunch of expensive hi-fi equipment, you can sort of conspicuously display your high disposable income to members of the opposite sex.
Knowing what Mr. Glover is up to today, and an earlier conversation you and I had, Bobby asks the question: is movie piracy still a big issue today? Or is it worse?
It's still big. It's still it's actually the biggest form of piracy. The biggest form by far is people pirating Game of Thrones. So Game of Thrones, and this is why it actually happens for a very specific reason. How many people here watch Game of Thrones? Not that many. Wow. Interesting. Okay, you guys are too cool for Game of Thrones. I don't watch it either, actually.
Well, maybe it's on a premium service, right?
Yeah, but you can pirate it. Anyway. So what happens in Game of Thrones is they show it in the US, and then like 14 hours later, they show it in Australia and other territories. Okay. But this creates a huge problem if you're a Game of Thrones fan, because Game of Thrones is really spoiler heavy and it's really plot driven. Okay. So for those 14 hours that you can't watch Game of Thrones, you have to put yourself in a media cocoon, right? You can't look at Twitter. You'll get your Game of Thrones spoiled if you go onto Twitter. So that narrow time difference actually causes people, including subscribers to HBO services, just to go pirate it so they can have it at the exact same time across all regions. This was a way that a lot of the music pirates used to get music too. They would arbitrage like a trans-international release date. So an album would come out in Japan a week earlier before it would come out in the US. So they'd make sure to have a guy in their leaking group in Japan who could just, you wouldn't even have to break into the factory. You just physically go to the Japanese music store and buy it, and then it'd be available in the US. It used to be in the country for a long time that all music was released on Tuesdays. There's a new record store Tuesday. But actually each country, and that was the US, each country had a different release date. This year, or last year, they moved globally to everyone's releasing new music on Fridays. So I think the music industry has caught up to that. That's why Game of Thrones is so pirated. With movie piracy, it continues to be an ongoing problem for the industry. They have fought it, especially if you have a great home theater, you can actually surpass the movie-going experience via piracy. They continue to invest in like high-run box office ticket sales, but really the DVD market the Blu-ray market is not very healthy. And that's primarily, I think, because of piracy. It still really hurts them a lot.
Nathaniel wanted to know, do you feel artists should be more appreciative of sharing of physical or legally obtained copies of music? Exposure may not always be directly profitable, but it can lead to future sales and boost their audience.
I mean, if you're starting out, getting pirated is a seal of approval. And I say this as a guy who got his book pirated very early, before it came out. It felt great. There's demand, right? There's demand. That's what it means. People are interested in your work. And that's the hard part. Not that physically monetizing your work isn't hard either, but getting anybody to give a shit is really the hard part. And it definitely is the case that file sharing and piracy services can help you do that. Now, if I was a legacy artist with, 50 million in annual sales or whatever, and these pirates come along and cut that, three quarters.
No good.
I'm not going to like that at all. So I totally understand why like Kiss is not very happy right now. Plus they're aging out. Their fan base is their legacy act. For them it's terrible. It's bad. For younger act with really starting out, just getting any interest in your work is big.
But it would be hard to differentiate who's going to set the dichotomy there.
Yeah, and where are you? If you're in the middle, if you're halfway through your career, if you're building a career, does it help you or hurt you? I don't really know. But if you're at the stage of your career where you're trying to get a record deal for the first time, put it all for free. It's the only way. Which I assume no one here has yet sold a platinum album, right? Raise your hand if you've got platinum.
Speaking of raising hands, are there any questions anybody wanted to add that might not have been articulated yet? Just want to get some last licks in.
Yeah.
Can you explain, and you say it in the book, it might have been when Kanye and 50 Cent came out at the same time, and how, even though it was available for free, sales were still going.
Right. This was one of the big questions that gets asked a lot, is how badly does leaking hurt album sales? And the answer is definitely a little bit. When movies leak, you can definitely see that the box office isn't quite as good. One thing that happens is if the album is not very good, then people pick up on that and they don't buy it. So it's real. If you're putting out a mediocre album and it leaks, then you're really in trouble. In Kanye's case, though, 50 Cent put out an album that was decent. Curtis is decent, and Graduation was groundbreaking. So arguably, like he deserved to win, first of all, and the fact that people were hearing it beforehand probably helped. It acted as a form of advertising. It may have actually led to more sales of Kanye West. A lot of people think of that, sort of historians of music, I think, or critics of music, are now thinking that him winning that was a real turning point for rap music. It really changed what it was supposed to be about and what the popular sound could sound like. That's come up in a couple other books that I've read about contemporary rap music, which, if it's not clear, I love. And spend a lot of time thinking about. So, yeah, it hurt sales. It hurt 50 Cent sales. Look, if your album is a dud and it leaks, then you really have a dud on your hands because no one's going to buy it. There's no demand, and they know. One of the music industry and the publishing industry and the movie industry's dirty secrets is that a lot of times they know that something's a piece of shit, and they're just counting on this. I call this the Batman versus Superman effect. They know it's a piece of shit, and they're still going to do $400 million in sales, right? But if it leaks early, they can't get away with it, and I think that's what hurts the most. Does that make sense? Okay.
So one question I wanted to throw at the end here is from Jeanette, and she says in the closing in an article you wrote, actually it's from the book as well, is they took a few pictures of the albums he'd collected over the years, but they left behind the duffel bag full of compact discs.
Yep.
Even as evidence, they were worthless,
Yep.
referring to the end of the CD and the takeover of then file sharing. Streaming now made an effort to make music cost something again. In the years ahead, do you think the value of music will ever eventually rise back up?
I think yes. I actually am cautiously bullish and optimistic about the music industry. I think what will happen is that people will start subscribing, and this is the cable TV effect. And they'll be subscribed, and then, oh, yeah, I just automatically bills my bank account every month. I don't really pay attention. And slowly they'll start to ratchet up the price. And very closely, like very quietly, they'll start to do it. But they'll continue doing it. And the expectation that $10 enough is a month for all the music you'd ever want to hear ever recorded will get more to an expectation of like $15 or $16 or $17. And in the meantime, I think it will become just standard that you have such a subscription. It will be rare for people not to have their own subscription, especially if you have even just a little disposable income.
So music as a utility, like water?
Music as a utility, like water or like your cell phone bill. Think about how really expensive your frickin' cell phone bill is. It's thousands of dollars a year. It's out of control, and you pay it. You don't really think about it. And if music can get to that point, then they can make a lot of money.
And hopefully some of you will be the beneficiaries of that.
Oh, I hope so. And I hope too also that you do something groundbreaking, that artistically and creatively, because just to tip my hand, I do feel that we're in kind of a period of music that is not as good as it could be or should be. I think past periods of music, there were golden ages of sort of contemporary pop American music. I think sonically, music is as creative as it's ever been, but lyrically and sort of it's not as ambitious as it could be. And I hope that some of you make that. And I also want to say thank you very much for having me. It's a real joy. I don't get to talk to people your age very often. It's really great to hear what you have to see, hear what you have to say, and to see all of you as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for coming. And the book, there's a paperback coming out?
Yeah, paperback launches on June. So if you don't feel like paying the full hardcover retail and you don't want to pirate it from the Russians, you can buy the paperback.
And there'll be some updates?
There'll be some updates. Oh yeah, there's one of the actually found after I published the book, the rabid neurosis, the original founder of the conspiracy was a 15-year-old kid living in his parents' basement at the time, contacted me, and he's now a very successful 36-year-old software engineer with like several $1 million. It has nothing to do with piracy. But I was talking about it. He had this amazing quote. He was like, "Yeah, I barely graduated from high school. I never went to college. But when I was 16, I was running essentially a multinational shadow criminal empire, and everything that I've done in my life since then has been easier than that." Like he was doing it with a modem out of his mom's basement.
Wow. Well, let's thank Stephen for coming out.